Hello everyone, thank you very much for coming. Welcome to our this year's Andre Adler's lecture, a talk within our NYU Physics Colloquium series. This lecture is dedicated to the memory of our dear colleague Andre Adler, who passed away in summer 2020. And as many of you will remember, he has been a dedicated educator and enthusiastic supporter of all our students. And to celebrate his memory and keep his memory alive, we have installed this lecture that has been in existence since, where we keep educating ourselves further in how to teach and learn physics better, because there's always more to learn. There's always a room for improvement. And so in this spirit, I'm very happy to introduce our today's speaker, who's an expert in physics education. It's Professor Natasha Holmes from Cornell University. Natasha has completed her undergraduate studies at University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, her PhD at University of British Columbia, and then she continued with her postdoctoral training in Stanford. Since 2017, she has been at Cornell leading her research group, where she is currently Associate Professor of Physics. Her group studies teaching and learning physics, so both directions, and specifically how students acquire skills and content knowledge, so something that we're all very much interested in, and how different environments affect students in their learning abilities, in the motivation, drive, persistence, and so on. She uses in her research both qualitative and quantitative measures to assess that, so will provide us a very strong base for all the results. Her present largest focus is actually on the efficacy of hands-on laboratory courses. So this is something near and dear to many of us here in the audience, since this is a topic and kind of a nut that we're trying to crack for many, many years. So I'm very much looking forward to learn from Natasha today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here, and I'm excited to talk. I've had wonderful conversations today with so many people thinking so critically and interestingly about undergraduate physics labs, and so hopefully I can sort of poke on all of the things that you're all already ruminating on in some fun ways. So there we go. So I run a physics education research group at Cornell University. We also have colleagues in biology and engineering and economics education research as well. So just wonderful grad students and undergrads and postdocs who've been working with us, contributing in multiple ways to the work that we're doing. And so I am in a physics department doing education research on the teaching and learning of our discipline, and my focus has particularly been in lab courses, which is what we're going to talk about today. So the title of my, whoops, I think it's backwards, not forwards. There we go. So the title of this talk was about what does it mean for labs to be authentic? And so what I want to think about is sort of what does it mean for a physics lab or experiment to be authentic? And so I heard some people talking about this already as they were sort of coming in, but I'll give you a second to turn to your neighbor. What do you think it means for a physics lab or experiment to be authentic? And I'll get a couple of voices from that. So 30 seconds to talk to your neighbor.
Turn talk.
This exercise worked ridiculously well. So well done.
Thank you. Okay, what have we got? We get a couple just quick, sort of one word, one phrase answers. We'll just get a couple of different ideas. What does it mean for a physics lab to be authentic?
Failure.
Failure, beautiful, love it. Other steps.
Hands-on.
Hands-on, perfect. What else?
Yeah, related to David, it should be hard to get to work.
It should be hard to get to work, so there's like debugging and troubleshooting and banging your head and trial and error and all that good stuff. Yep. Other stuff. Cool.
Should it measure a physical law? Or should it be related to physics?
Is it related to physics?
No.
Yeah, we assume it should have something to do with physics if I'm specifying a physics lab or experiment. Yeah, totally. Okay, lots of different ways to think about it. Often the best way to think about something is to think about what it isn't. And so what is an example of an inauthentic physics lab? I'm gonna give you the answer to this one as again, just an example, because I think it's a lot easier for us to contextualize. Okay, that's not what authentic looks like. So this is an example of, don't read all the text, don't worry, I'm going to highlight stuff. A set of instructions for what I would consider to be an inauthentic physics lab. And some of the things that I think are inauthentic in this are that the students, they're doing an Atwood's machine experiment and they're told to pick a pair of masses and set up an Atwood's machine, so they're specifically told sort of what to do. They then are told to drop the mass 3 times, do it for 7 different mass pairs. They're eventually told to plot their data, and the slope should be the acceleration due to gravity, and the intercept should be close to 0. And so they're told exactly sort of what the conclusion, what the outcome of their experiment could be. And these hit on sort of what I think are sort of the key things of what shows up in what I call an inauthentic physics lab. The first one, the students aren't making any of the experimental decisions about how to do the setup, how to set up the equipment. They're just following these sort of protocols that are given to them to execute. And the second piece is that the experiments are not testing unanswered questions, right? They are doing an experiment where they are effectively told what the answer should be, and that's not authentic. That's not what experimental physicists do. We're not excited about confirming things that we already know. In this case, the experiments are basically aiming to verify and demonstrate established knowledge. There's a lot of other things, but those are 2 of the sort of handles that we've really been focusing on, what it is that makes things inauthentic. Okay, and so I'm gonna just sort of dump a bunch of claims one claim that inauthentic labs are sort of problematic for a whole bunch of different reasons, and basically the sort of last decade of my research has been really just teasing apart all of these ways in which they are problematic. They really give students inauthentic perspectives on what it means to do experiments, to do physics, to do science, all of those things. They do not sufficiently develop students' experimentation or critical thinking skills, and we've a couple of times tried to measure, but still find no sort of measurable added value to actually learning the physics concepts that they seek to demonstrate and verify. And so there's sort of this rich, and again, there's some citations there if you want to read more, and I'm always happy to talk about this, but we sort of come to this conclusion that these traditional labs are not a good way to be teaching a whole bunch of different things that we care about, and so what do we do instead? And so what is an example of what I would call an authentic physics lab? Well, I think the most authentic thing we can imagine is to be doing experimental physics research. And here I just stole pictures of experimentalists from my university website, and apparently it involves looking very intently at small things. As far as I can tell. But we can imagine that being, the things that experimental physicists do, that would be the bar for authentic experiments. And so what we're trying to start to set up now is, how well do we approximate that? How well do we have to approximate that? And this is going to get us into a spherical cow analogy that I apologize in advance for. But the analogy would be that an authentic physics lab should approximate experimental physics research. And so this is my Microsoft Copilot creation of a cow, where it's not exactly a cow, but it's approximately a cow. And part of the question is, how approximate do we need to get what kinds of benefits for students? And of course, on the other side of that, to me, a traditional verification lab is literally we're not even at spherical cow, that's really just a sphere sitting in a field, right? And it's so far from what experimental physics actually looks like. So, last one, I promise. What we've been thinking about is, one of the things that we've been testing is what I'm now calling sort of the spherical cow version of experimental physics, and trying to get a sense of, is that good enough? And so we've referred to these as sort of simulating authentic labs, so simulated authenticity, where we're taking what we think are the kinds of practices and ways of thinking and doing that experimental physicists do, and we're simulating it in the context of a sort of introductory physics course. And for reasons that you will eventually learn, I'm going to eventually start calling these SALT labs, but we'll get there. So the inauthentic labs, again, this was sort of the 2 sort of key issues that we came up with. So my sphere in a field, right? Students aren't making experimental physics decisions, and they're not testing unanswered questions. They know the answer to the experiment before they go in. And so the first sort of iteration on something to make it a little bit more authentic is to tweak those 2 levers. So can we instead have students make some key decisions? Maybe they don't have to decide everything, right? Again, we're simulating, not replicating. So students learn how to make decisions for experiments, and students test unanswered questions, or at least unanswered to them. And this is going to be sort of where the meat of what we end up talking about comes in. So there's learning, using the experiments to learn something new, not just to verify or demonstrate things from lecture. And then on top of that, they should also be learning various skills and attitudes and understandings of experimentalists. So let me give you some flavors of what this looks like. So, whoops, wrong way. There we go. So this is our period of a pendulum lab, which is the first lab that we run in our semester. The students spend 2 different weeks testing the amplitude dependence of the period of a pendulum. And we structure it so we have them release from 10 and 20 degrees and get them thinking about sort of how precisely do you have to measure things, and is there a detectable difference between the amplitudes. In some cases, they remember or they've seen the small angle approximation, and so some of them know that there might be something there. In a lot of cases, even if they have seen the small angle approximation in the derivation, they don't know how that connects to the real system in front of them. And then in other cases, it's just they have no idea, and they assume from the sort of textbook equation that it's not going to change. And so we spend 2 weeks just attacking this and thinking about uncertainty and precision, because in order to detect the small difference, you need to get your uncertainty really, really small. And so this is a situation where like we know the answer to the question, but often the students really don't know the answer to the experiment. And the choices that we have them making are about how many trials do they do, how, if they run the stopwatch once, how many swings do they want it to do. They often get very concerned about the amplitude changing and drag and things like that. And so then we get them testing, well, how many times can you let it swing before the amplitude changes? There's a bunch of really fun plays to play around just with this one research question. The other example, I keep hitting the wrong button. The other example I'll tell you about is our stretchy things lab. This is our version of a Hooke's Law lab, where instead of just giving them a beautiful spring and showing them that the force is proportional to the extension, we get them to bring in stretchy things, and they have to test sort of the extent to which their stretchy thing obeys Hooke's Law. And so this first picture is actually during the pandemic, where a group of students were testing bungee cords, but they not only were testing whether the bungee cord had a linear force versus extension, they also wanted to look at what happens when you double it up. Is it also linear? Does the spring constant change? Does it get bigger or smaller? We've had students do stuff where they like twist things and look at the relationship. But my personal favorite one was the gummy worm group who brought in a gummy worm. And not only were they trying to track the force versus extension, they really wanted to understand the behavior right before it breaks. And so they were trying to collect this really detailed data. And then you also then have this question they had to really grapple with. Reproducibility, right? Because once it breaks, they can't take the data again. And is every gummy worm the same? Like, so much depth and beauty in a gummy worm. It was lovely. So I think this is authentic. I don't know. I think it's like authentic. Yeah.
How many hours should it take?
So for these labs, we spend basically 4 hours on each of these topics. So we took out, students need 2 hours a week, and so they'll spend 2 sessions on each of these labs.
Is it one planning, one performing the lab?
Both planning and performing and iterating. And so we give them sort of this time to go a little bit deeper than they typically would in a 2-hour session. Okay, and so we've done a fair bit of research that shows that this kind of simulated authenticity, or at the very least, these labs that try to teach these experimentation skills rather than the physics concept, are generally beneficial. So this is just a set of data from, pixels are awful, I'm so sorry. Set of data from a paper where we ran some assessments pre and post at actually a ton of different institutions. And we got the instructors to characterize whether their labs were skills-based, so trying to teach these sorts of experimentation skills, or concepts-based. And the 2 assessments that we ran, one of them is the E-class, the Colorado Learning Attitudes About Science Survey for Experimental Physics, and then the Physics Lab Inventory of Critical Thinking, the PLIC. And in both cases, we see this sort of systematic increase. So students who are in these skills-based labs come away with more expert-like attitudes and critical thinking skills related to experimentation as a result of those kinds of skills-based courses. The other one we also did when we did a controlled experiment at Cornell. We also tracked, so students submitted their lab notes documenting sort of all of their decision-making during the experiments. And we tracked 2 behaviors. Do they iterate on their experimental design sort of as they're going? And then do they evaluate model limitations? And so these are all of the labs across the semester, and we see a lot of variability in how much they do each of these things. But both of these skills were basically unseen in the traditional lab. Students did not do any of this iterating on their experiments. They would just follow the protocol and get out as quickly as possible. And if they wouldn't evaluate model limitations, we have another set of analysis where we found that actually students often would either their claims wouldn't match their data. They would be, if something didn't agree with the sort of textbook model, they would end up actually sort of either manipulating the data or just sort of trying to explain it away or ignore it completely. And so now we see in these courses, students doing a lot more of this sort of careful investigation and critical thinking again about the data. Okay, so this is what I sort of, these pendulum labs, this stretchy things lab, I sort of think of as the like first order correction maybe, or the first order of the approximation towards experimental physics. And so then what we've been thinking about now is there a second order correction and is it better? So this is my slightly more defined cow, spherical cow. And is there something else that gets us closer to authentic physics research, and is it beneficial for students to do that? And this is sort of where we're moving now in our research program. And so we're taking inspiration from a type of instruction called course-based undergraduate research experiences that actually came out of biology. So their response to the traditional labs are bad was literally undergraduate research is good, and so let's just literally scale up undergraduate research. Students are given authentic research questions by a PI in the department, and basically something that you would give to undergraduate students in the summer, you instead give to an entire class of however many students, and they all work in groups on this sort of research project. And I'll show you some examples. But the key characteristic to these, they describe them as having these 5 properties that they have to incorporate the use of scientific practices, engage students in discovery, explore authentic experiments that are broadly relevant to the field, include and require opportunities for iteration, and incorporate collaboration. We'll come back to this list, but let me give you an example just so you can contextualize this. So this is an example called phage hunters from biology, and anyone with biology knowledge is gonna start correcting me, please do. Undergraduate and high school students may isolate a novel bacteriophage, grow it and extract its DNA, sequence the genome, and analyze the sequence relative to other genomes. The key scientific assumption is that the bacteriophage population is vast, estimated at 1,031 particles globally, enormously diverse and poorly understood. So there's a low probability of being identical to a previously characterized isolate. The prospect of discovering a genuinely new virus or many new genes provides strong motivation. The knowledge and technical skills required to isolate a phage from the environment are modest. The barriers to being a successful phage hunter and research scientist are minimal, and opening the doors, laboratory doors to all students. So this is a situation, so again, this is a phenomenon that is poorly understood in the literature, which gives students this authentic, like quote unquote authentic, I shouldn't have used that word, actually publishable level of activity that is of interest to biologists, as I understand. Yeah.
I think it's 10 to the 31.
Yeah, I hope so.
Oh, that makes more sense. 1,031 is a very odd and specific number. Thank you. That was my copy pasting from the paper situation. Sorry. Thank you. Okay. I've given this talk like 3 times and no one else has picked up on that. So okay. And then there's a recent cure actually in physics from the University of Colorado Boulder that they called CFLARE. So the Colorado Physics Laboratory Academic Research Effort, CFLARE, is a project seeking to help answer a long-standing question in solar physics. What mechanisms are behind the coronal heating? The temperature of the sun's corona is millions of Kelvin greater than that of the photosphere, despite being much further from the center of the sun. Several theories have been proposed to explain the coronal heating, and it seems likely that the corona is heated by multiple interrelated mechanisms. However, it is still possible to narrow down the list of contributing mechanisms and perhaps identify which contributions dominate. So again, the lab instructors got connected to someone in solar physics. They proposed this unanswered question using an open data set that the students could then basically sift through and try to analyze. And they did this for several semesters and eventually actually published a paper in the Astrophysical Journal, coronal heating as determined by the solar flare frequency distribution obtained by aggregating case studies. That means all of your little lab groups are all contributing to this, and they aggregated each of those sort of sets of analyses. And particle physicists may not be impressed by this, but as a physics education researcher where we publish with like 2 or 3 people, This is the author list.
Oh, wow.
And it's every undergraduate who participated in the course during the semesters that it was run.
So did they collect the data?
They did not collect the data. It was an open source, open access data set that existed.
So
That's posted somewhere.
maybe this is not the time to have this, but like I would challenge the idea that if you didn't collect any data you've done in the lab or an experiment.
Totally great question. We can debate that because there are many areas of physics where that may or may not happen. And so part of the motivation for the project that I'm about to describe was exactly that one of like, yes, analyzing an open data source is research, but is it experimental physics research, and what would it look like in physics to get your hands on equipment and do a similar thing? That's sort of where we're heading. So I don't disagree, and yet it is debatable. Okay, so going back to this list of 5 pieces, right? When I first started engaging with this literature, I mean, to me, I had a lot of concerns about this list. So first of all, incorporating the use of scientific practices and collaboration, I think that's a part of almost every physics lab in to some extent. The engaging students in discovery and requiring opportunities for iteration, this is something that we had put into these like simulated authenticity labs that we've been designing with so in terms of discovery, the students don't know the answer to what happens to the gummy worm. They did have to iterate and try multiple things. They had time to do that. So in theory, we're also doing that. And so the crux of it, right, has to do with this idea of broadly relevant to the field. And so what we've been interested in is trying to understand how important is that piece. Does it matter, or can we get the same outcomes as the other cases? And I wrap in discovery here because I think that there is an interplay between discovery and broad relevance, which leads me to my next set of hilarious cartoons. So we've been starting to sort of map the space between these two sort of constructs. So on the one axis, discovery, there's this piece of, is the answer known to the students already? Is it known to the instructor but not the students? Is it sort of understood in the scientific community but not really publishable? And then is it actually unknown in the scientific community and therefore publishable? Sorry. And so on the other axis, this idea of broad relevance, there's sort of this, is the physics that they're studying, is it really not relevant beyond the classroom? And this would be sort of our intro to physics mechanics stuff, rolling balls down ramps. Whether or not that's relevant to physicists outside of the classroom is debatable. Is it something that's like applicable to research activities? And then is it really relevant to the sorts of things that researchers do? So I put our sort of very traditional labs down in this corner. Everything that I'm going to draw are going to be these like kind of spread out fuzzy things. I don't think there are hard boundaries, but it gives you the sense of sort of where things are located. And then the course-based undergraduate research experiences live way up in that top corner, right? They've defined them as these things that are unknown to the scientific community, literally relevant to researchers, way up in that far corner. And so what I want to try to map is, what is the effect of that axis versus that one? And how do we sort of make our way across? Do we need to be filling out that middle, and what does it look like in the middle? Because most of the literature from biology mostly is comparing these cures to traditional labs and saying, look, this is so much better. It's like, of course, but surely there's some sort of gradient in here. So now if we go back to my spherical cow, and we can put that sort of along these axes, right, that we have, you go from the sphere way at the bottom, the spherical cow, I think lives somewhere sort of in here, the slightly more defined spherical cow, and then this sort of cartoon cow up here. And when I showed someone a version of this hilarious thing that I thought was so funny, they're like, shouldn't you put an actual cow up here? A picture of an actual cow. And this is where I don't know, because I think that there is a question of, as soon as you are teaching and giving students a grade, I feel like there is something that is necessarily inherently inauthentic involved in that. And I don't think we can actually call it undergraduate research when the student, anyway, we can debate that later. Okay, and so one more time, just to put the labs that we've been talking about. So traditional labs are down here, the cures are up here. These simulated authenticity labs, I'm putting down here because in most cases we're still dealing with sort of the first year intro level physics concepts. And so the students are doing discovery, but they're not doing physics that physicists care. I mean, I know we all care about Newton's laws very deeply and it's very relevant, but you know what I mean, right? They're not doing particle physics, they're not doing condensed matter. Like that's the stuff that physicists are thinking about all the time. And so what we've been now experimenting with is sort of filling in this space here and getting a sense of what that middle ground might look like. So this is where my flavors of physics labs come in. We've got salt and pepper, and we recently came up with the acronym SAGE, and my students think I'm crazy. Anyway, okay, and so what we're doing right now is a controlled experiment between salt and pepper. We're separately just evaluating this SAGE lab that I'll tell you about in a second. And so really what we've done is we've barely tweaked the discovery axis, but we've, we think, increased this broad relevance axis, and we're trying to sort of see what the effect of that is on students. Okay, now what is salt and what is pepper? Or we know what salt is, what is pepper? So pepper is a project where I'm really bad at acronyms. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, can you go back to
Yes.
this slide? I'm a little bit curious about the y-axis, how you're going right between not relevant beyond the classroom and applicable to research activities. It seems like there are many things you could learn in the lab that, like circuits,
Yes,
that are not interesting to researchers but would still be like
relevant. Yeah.
really useful
Yeah.
to know in your
Yes.
life.
Yes, I agree. And I think that there are probably, exactly, like an electronics lab, stuff like that is probably closer up here. But in the intro labs, the only piece of like authentic equipment our students were doing was oscilloscopes. And in this case, we're mostly thinking about the physics topic, like the research question that they are being asked to investigate. Is that relevant?
Or like how to fix a car, or like how does your microwave work, like all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's not research, but like I'm just
What's your
saying,
question?
I feel like you need to add some relevance, some other relevance to your y-axis. Like it might not be relevant to research, but it can still be relevant beyond the classroom.
I think that there are other dimensions, right? And I think that like personal relevance is very different, and I think that's a completely different impact on students. Community relevance, I think there's other sources of relevance. In this case, we are thinking specifically, maybe I should specify the label that it is broad relevance to researchers, to the scientific community.
Well, that
That
seems
last
like
word-
narrow.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, you were talking.
No, go ahead.
No, I think you're talking about the audience. You're talking about relevance to physicists
Yes.
or future physicists.
Yes.
If you're teaching an engineering physics course in an engineering school, things will look a little different and probably go back to talking about what you're talking about.
Well, I
So
go back to the
who's
thing
the
that we're
audience?
trying to simulate here is experimental physics research, right? And so yeah. That's why I narrow the axis to be about relevance to researchers, because that is the piece of authenticity that we're trying to replicate.
So in the earlier slide, you pointed out the importance of skills, building skills.
Yes.
And I think that's what Emily's talking about. And so maybe that's an additional axis where in some labs you use a device that sort of does itself and you don't really learn much about the skills, even though you can discover great science. And in other things, you use a soldering iron and you learn that the tip is hot and all sorts of good things like that.
Yes. I would put all of that somewhere up in this item number 1 though, right? Like to me, that's the incorporating the use of scientific practices. And I'm not interested. I know that that's important. I'm not interested in studying that right now, because I agree that that is just like fundamentally, that is the baseline to me, I guess is maybe how I'm thinking about it.
But that's the main difference between actually doing labs and going in a research group, right? Because if I wanted to do that, I would just go to a research group and learn this as an undergraduate student.
Sure.
While I go to the labs to get taught the very basic things to the person who was a high schooler a year ago, and that is a very different skill set. It is not yet applicable to research, but it will be when they will go and learn all this stuff in the lab. But if they can't solder, how could they go to a lab and do advanced stuff and stuff?
Many of them can't hammer.
But you're gonna measure something. Right?
We're gonna measure.
You're gonna measure, so the axes have to be relevant to what you're gonna measure. If you're not gonna measure how well they hammer,
Yes.
then
I can't. Yeah.
so these axes are
Relevant.
defined
Yes.
such that you're gonna they're relevant.
Thank you. Okay, let me Yeah, let me keep going and then we'll come back to this. We'll revisit this once I've painted more pictures. So the pepper flavor of labs comes from a collaboration with my experimental particle physics colleagues and our physics education research group, where we're trying to do something similar to the cures. We're trying to bring particle physics into that first year lab experience. And so the sort of metaphor is we're taking the physics of the CMS and putting it into what we're calling now the pepper shaker, which is a device that was adapted by Spencer Exani now at Delaware. When he was a postdoc at MIT, developed this thing called the MIT Cosmic Watch that measures cosmic ray muons just with a little piece of scintillator and PCB on a little, what was Arduino now, Raspberry Pi circuit board down at the bottom. And so we've been working with this incredible team, again, both the particle physics experts combined with the PER and lab experts, and then a wonderful group of undergrads that have been contributing to this work and helping us design and test and all kinds of stuff. And so the course now, sort of 15-week semester, we have about 12 weeks of labs. It starts with a rapid fire intro to particle physics, and then they do a set of experiments sort of understanding what the scintillator is and how it works. A set of experiments sort of unpacking the configuration of the device and what it means, what happens when you have things in coincidence mode, introducing those sorts of ideas. We've sort of reimagined these now, actually this semester, as sort of how do we know we're measuring muons as opposed to other stuff is basically what these have sort of become, again, to just like piece together and understand what this device is. Then they develop some research questions, they write a draft proposal, and then they've got multiple weeks of a project that they get to carry out and just in groups for multiple weeks, again, sort of digging into some funny stuff. And then the other pieces that we add on to this, right, we get them thinking about how do we actually quantify muon count rates, we introduce them to Poisson statistics, we teach them about things like trigger thresholds, coincidence mode, I think I already said that, and then the project. And so just some of the sample experiments that they do, right, they take the device to the basement, they go up to the top floor, they check altitude, then they realize that building material matters, so then they go outside, and Cornell's beautifully on a hill, so then they walk their way down the hill, things like that. Students have been doing coincidence orientation, so they set it up like this, and then they tilt it as a function of angle to look, are these things actually coming from the sky, or are we measuring noise from somewhere else? Looking at the coincidence separation and sort of understanding how all of that works, things like that. We had one group who wanted to test whether the effect of motion changed the count rate, and so I don't understand why, but they got on bicycles and started riding their bikes with their little devices in their pockets. They get creative, it's great. So we've been doing for the last 3 semesters a controlled study. We have sort of 20 to 30 lab sections every semester, and so we effectively randomly assign each of the lab sections to either be a pepper group or a salt group. So both versions have learning goals related to experimentation skills, such as experimental design, data analysis, collaboration. We've got a mix of engineering and physics majors in the class, and in each case we run our labs in 3 separate rooms, and so we just picked that room 3 was going to be pepper labs, room 1 and 2 were going to be the other ones, and so it's an almost random assignment because students are enrolled at the same time, and it's just which room they end up getting picked into for those. And then we had our TAs assigned to either be pepper or salt labs each semester.
Is the salt like also using the muon detector? And
No, so the salt labs, this is the like pendulum and stretchy things, gummy worm group. Yeah. And so what we've been measuring, I'm going to tell you about 2 sort of sets of measurements. One is a smattering of pre-post tests that we give the students every semester. So the physics lab inventory of critical thinking that I briefly mentioned earlier, where it asks students, it gives them sort of a fake experiment and data and asks them to make sense of sort of what to trust and what to do. So thinking about proposing what are the next steps in an investigation, are these methods good, evaluating the data itself, all contextualized in a math on a spring experiment. And then we ask them about their self-efficacy, so students' confidence in their experimentation-related skills, their perceptions of agency, so how much control or freedom do they feel that they have in the lab doing their experiments, their sense of belonging in the lab, and their sense of recognition. Do their friends see them as a physics person or as a physicist? And so what we've done, we're evaluating their post scores between these 2 conditions, controlling for their pre-scores. So we're effectively looking at for 2 students who come in with the same incoming knowledge and sense of recognition, sense of all of those other things. How much do they get if they're assigned to a pepper or salt lab? Do they systematically end up at a different place at the end? And so what I'm going to show you are the effects of pepper minus salt. So this is going to be the standard effect size. So again, each of the assessments along the x-axis here. And anything that is positive will basically mean that the pepper labs were higher than the salt labs. Anything that's negative means pepper labs are less than the salt labs. And anything, and then 0 means that they were equivalent effects. So quick prediction, think it's gonna be positive, negative, or flat? And I mean, maybe it's gonna vary by assessment outcome, but you can get a general sense, what do you think is gonna happen? On 3, you're gonna hold up a thumb either here, here, or here. On 3, 1, 2, 3.
Thanks.
Okay, I think there's like a net up happening here. There's a bunch of people here, a bunch of people with 2 hands going.
I think the skills are going to go down. I think the one where they.
The click one is going to go down,
But
maybe
the
these
one where like, did I
attitude
have fun
ones-
doing physics is
But
going to
the
go up.
attitude ones are going to go up. Yeah, I think that would make sense. That's a great prediction. This is why I love to do experiments. We've done this 2 semesters now. We were surprised every time. And so this has about 1,000 students in the data set, and we are pretty precisely seeing nothing, which I think is a very interesting and compelling null result that I'm very excited about.
Well, what if
One
they
of my
just
students was like, "Oh no, it's null!" I'm like, "That's so cool." What
What
does
if
that
they
mean?
just did no labs at all and went
Room for it.
This is where comic books are.
We are assuming this is all better than no labs, right? We're already starting at a baseline of like pretty good, but
Well, I mean, does the
Boost the
Plick
minds.
score increase? Like
the
if
Plick
you-
score does increase. All of these do increase. Yes, that's a great question, right? All of these do increase, and the increases are equivalent across the 2 conditions. Yeah, yeah. And I did have the raw data, but it's like so many.
Like
points,
so when you
I
say
stopped.
you say null result because you're like not quite an error bar away on most things, right?
Exactly, right? Like the only like none of these end up being statistically significantly different from 0, right? I think the only one is that in some cases, we also looked at individuals. We sort of broke it down by various subgroups just to make sure that any one group wasn't getting an advantage in any particular case. And we're seeing, there's few very small things, but then we're just in statistical noise. So.
But like, what's the size of the increase then? Like, on this scale, like.
It wouldn't make sense on this scale. These are like regression coefficient effect sizes, but the Plick scores are very small. Unfortunately, we rarely move the needle on those. But do I have them? Hold on, I think I have these hidden. Oh, did I? Oh, I took them out. They are gone.
Okay.
I will find them. They do exist. They are small.
I was wondering, is this a homogeneous group? Like, are these all people who want to be physics majors?
No, this is engineers and engineers, computer science, math, and physics majors.
So, because you could imagine that the people who want to be physics majors might be turned on by the.
Totally. We also did a separate analysis where we just pulled out the physics majors, and it's the same.
Okay.
I agree. I was very surprised.
What is the fraction of physicists in the sample?
In the fall semester, they're about a 6th. It's not very many. So this is driven by engineers, which is why we did the separate analysis for the physics majors, just looking at the physics majors themselves, and we see the same.
I'm just mentioning because maybe the sample size is too small to draw any conclusions at all. You'll never reject it all.
1,000 students?
Well, 1/6 of that, and then you split it into 3, right?
Oh, sure.
So it's like a factor of 18.
Sure, but the trend for the physics majors is still the same. So even if I don't have the precision, the size of the effects are still very small, right? And so then, one of the benefits of physics education research is that we have to worry both about the statistical significance and the practical significance, right? So even if I had 10,000 students and was able to detect a very small effect, do I care? Right? Is that actually going to drive my curriculum and my policy change when the effect is so small, even if I have the precision to detect it?
What about the cost, by the way?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. And so the detectors themselves, we've gotten down to be less than $100 a piece. And so then we just have a suite of about like 20 per lab section. So, and that's all they use the whole semester, right? It's not a whole bunch of different equipment. So it's actually not super expensive. The limiting factor right now is just access to scintillator, is my understanding from the particle physicists. We just like can't get enough.
Do the students get to keep it and continue to use it?
No, they do not. We reuse them. Yeah, unfortunately. It would be cool if they could. Okay. Oh, we are going. Okay, I'm gonna quickly blast through. All of those measures are interesting, but they also have nothing to do with authenticity. So the other piece that we've been looking for is, do they perceive authenticity in this experience? And so we've been using an assessment. It's actually a reflection assignment that we give to students as homework. We call it Memos to Future Researchers. And we get them to give advice to future students in the course about going through the class. And this was one that was used by the C-Flare Cure lab at CU Boulder. So we're trying to actually compare against what they've done. So we get them to write an informal letter, talking about their experience, give recommendations. So describe their personal experience and any advice, describe your final project, what conclusions you drew, and any ideas that students should have in the future. So importantly, none of this actually prompts students to talk about authenticity, but in a lot of really interesting cases, they do talk about whether they found the experience to be authentic or not. So as we read through the memos, we're looking for evidence of direct authenticity. So do they say stuff like, we did real research in this lab? Or do they say, I really felt like a scientist or a physicist? Or do they say, I really learned like what research is about by taking this lab course? And then indirect authenticity, we don't see very much of this in ours, but the Boulder people saw this a lot, right? That they're making a relevant discovery. It's gonna have a societal impact. They had to collaborate with other scientists, and their work was ultimately publishable, right? Which is what they see a lot of. And then there's this piece of, do they engage in various research components, such as scientific practices, that they're building on prior studies, that they experience failure, iteration, or decision-making, that they're like agents and get to make decisions about the labs. So a couple of beautiful examples. 2 future students, welcome to Physics 1110. It should be a good time. Here's a bit about my experience and time in the course. This course is great because I was able to learn how to use data to support findings in a laboratory setting. Really critical to this class and engineering as a whole are statistical tools such as t-tests and chi-squared tests. This class is big on these as they allow us to better interpret experimental results. This class also taught me how to design and conduct experiments based on specific parameters, which gave me a bigger appreciation for how research is conducted. So as a researcher, I read this beautiful essay and I go through and I highlight things like, okay, here is a bunch of scientific practices that they listed. Here they sort of indicate that they're understanding what research is, right, by saying it's engineering as a whole, bigger appreciation for how experiments are conducted. This is beautiful. Dear future Physics 1110 student, now I know that you've only signed up for an introductory physics lab. However, I do want to emphasize that this course will truly shape you into a researcher. And then they go on to say a bunch of other stuff. So again, this idea of like, you're really going to feel like a scientist, you're going to feel like a researcher. And then just to show you that I'm not just going to cherry pick all of the best examples, dear future researchers, this class at first may seem stupid and the dumbest class to ever exist. And that's what I thought. And that's still what I think. I dreaded going to this lab every Monday. I always had a great time with my lab mates. This class gave me the opportunity to make a few friends, and as much as I hate it, helped me as a researcher. The course content is boring quite a lot. It's very hard staying awake, so I recommend bringing something that will keep you awake. For me, I always had an energy drink on hand, even though only water is allowed.
Is this a salt kit or a pepper kit?
I don't remember. I wish I remembered, but I don't. It's beautiful. And even with all of that cynicism, right, it did help me as a researcher, which I thought was really beautiful. Okay, so we go through all of these memos, we tally up how many of the different memos indicated any of these various things. And so what I'm going to show you is a crazy graph. We're actually going to compare to the data from the Boulder cure as well so that we can have this sort of context. And it's going to just be on the y-axis the fraction of students that indicated one of the various codes along the bottom. And in the Boulder paper, important, they only identified things when, especially the research components, when they were in collaboration with something authentic. So if a student just said, I learned how to design an experiment, the Boulder people wouldn't count it. They would only count it if it was also tied to being an authentic experience. In our data, we're keeping track of the non-authentic things that I think are still authentic, even if they don't perceive them as authentic, right? So if a student says, I had a lot of, we really experienced and had to overcome a bunch of failure, I care about that, even if they don't specifically say, and that was authentic or whatever it might be. So you'll see sort of 2 colors. But this is, someone's sending me a Slack message, I'm so sorry. This is the Boulder data, and so in this case we see sort of, 10%, 15% of students indicate this sort of doing real research. Oh goodness. A bunch of students, there we go. Very few students actually indicating that they felt like a scientist, a bunch sort of saying that they understood real research, but the real signal is in this indirect authenticity stuff. They felt like a third of students indicate making a relevant discovery or having societal impact. A number commenting on publishable collaboration. Huge spike here, particularly on scientific practices, right? That they get to engage in all this stuff. Okay, and so then this is our preliminary data for the Pepper labs first. And so doing real research, right, goes down, which we sort of understand. These two seem like a slightly bigger signal. We have nothing almost in indirect authenticity. The doing publishable science, we've recorded if students just said things like, you're gonna do experiments where you don't know the answer, right? This idea of discovery, we sort of tapped into publishable science. And then our scientific practices or the research components are kind of all over the place. Again, this gray means that they talk about it, but not specifically tied to authenticity. And so we're sort of interested in the difference between these. Ready for the salt? Think it's gonna be way different, totally the same? I don't know. It's like kind of different, but we're dealing with really small effects again. Very few saying did real research, which makes sense. These proportions seem very similar. The indirect stuff is very similar. There's probably some differences in there, but we need to kind of keep dissecting a little bit to understand what's happening. Importantly, right now, we're still only part of the way through all of our data analysis. Again, we've got 1,000 of these and we've gotten through 200. And so again, this is sort of preliminary stuff. Our next steps are going to be, we're working on a bunch of natural language processing, large language model things. We are pretty sure that computers can do the work of flagging each of those sentences for us. So we're testing a bunch of different approaches right now. And then the other thing in the fall, we did a bunch of what I call authenticity interventions to try to like really input and make these things feel more authentic. We added particle physics partners. So particle physicists from my department went to each lab and said, hey, I'm a particle physicist and isn't it cool that you're doing particle physics? And tried to just sort of make those connections. And then we also added what I call authenticity framing, where we like had the students, made them wear gloves. We had a whole bunch of like handle with care warnings because in the first semester, they were treating our lab equipment like students usually treat first year lab equipment. And one of our TAs on the Slack channel was like, I don't think the devices are supposed to smoke, right? No, they are not supposed to smoke. So we started putting in a whole bunch of stuff to be like, no, this is real physics equipment that you need to be careful with. And we're gonna see if that changes anything with the data, but to be determined. Okay, so I am running out of time. If you are curious, so Sage, this is, again, I literally have a Slack channel with my students where I'm like, help me come up with more spice flavor acronyms. And so we came up with SAGE. This is soft and active matter guided experiments, where we've turned our physics for like science students' labs into a set of these hex spots. So they're these little tiny moving, I'll show you a quick video, little tiny moving sort of robots that can exhibit basically like Brownian motion and random diffusion and things like that. And so our we sped up the video so my students talking and they're just very cool. We've got a computer vision program that tracks the position of each of these spots, and so then the students can analyze all of this beautiful data. And so we get them modeling sort of active motion. I think, is this one an experiment video too? Yeah. This is them in their little arena moving around. They're mesmerizing. And they make the most annoying noise, but they're super fun. So we have them tracking things, checking if they're random motion, and then we're just teaching them about, histograms and data visualization. We do a diffusion lab where they set up these little Lego boundaries, and then they have to try to diffuse from one side to the other. There we go. And they count sort of the diffusion rate as they go. So we're actively collecting a whole bunch of data right now. So far, so good. But we've got lots of data to analyze. So, okay, so just to wrap up, going back to this sort of picture that we've done, again, sort of what we were trying to test with the salt versus pepper is sort of, we changed that axis very little. we think we changed that axis fairly dramatically, but we're not seeing a huge effect, which to me says that broad relevance maybe doesn't matter to these students. But I think I am becoming more and more convinced that the role of discovery, when they're doing questions that they don't know the answer to, that ends up really being the crux of what they think is authentic and what they perceive. And that was almost equivalent between the two kinds of labs. So we're going to be digging into that a little bit more, but I'll just share one more quote from a memo that my postdoc found the other day, which is, this was the best part of the course that I think made me a better scientist. Instead of always having a hypothesis that tended to be correct, I would test things not knowing the result. And so this is just a beautiful characterization of what I think is the signal that we're seeing, that x-axis is the thing that matters, not the broad relevance. Or maybe the key contrast isn't about, or maybe it's actually that there's just some really nonlinear shenanigans, or maybe our instruction didn't actually communicate the relevance, or maybe there's another axis, or who knows, right? Like there's a ton of stuff to play with here, which is super fun. So with that, I will just acknowledge all the wonderful people who have contributed this, all of these projects in so many ways, and hopefully we can have a little bit more time to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, questions. Alex.
Have you considered, or would it even be possible to follow some of these students, the physics major specifically, into perhaps actual undergrad research projects and seeing what happens to these metrics, or if it has any effect on their choice to try to pursue that kind of thing?
Yeah, we want to try to, so tracking persistence, tracking experiences in research, upper division labs, things like that is all stuff that we have on our sort of on the back burner. I avoid longitudinal experiments. I avoid like committing to longitudinal experiments because things happen like pandemics, and all of a sudden all of that data that you've been so carefully collecting is a mess and tedious. So, but it is something that we, there should be enough institutional data at least to track. But I think like interviewing students when they get into research labs and stuff would be really interesting. Yeah.
If someone had asked me what I think the purpose of an introductory undergrad physics lab is, I don't know what I would have said, but I think part of it probably would have been like building intuition with non-intuitive physics concepts and more time with things that they're learning. And I don't know if I would have said having an experience similar to that of a professional scientist. And so I guess I'm curious why having an authentic experience should be the goal of undergrad physics labs.
Yeah, so okay, so on the one hand, I don't know that having an authentic experience necessarily has to be the goal. But we have done a number of studies, and using the lab as a space to supplement and reinforce the lecture material, just time and time again, is bad for so many reasons, right? So that
what metric, I guess? That's the question. Like, what is the metric to
so many. So I don't have any slides for this. I've tried to table this. Like I'm sick of talking about this stuff. The one of the studies that we did, we found a number of institutions that had optional labs, and so we could literally optional labs whose purpose was to reinforce the lecture material, and so we could literally compare the students who did and didn't take the lab on the exam scores. Do they end up different? Now, students choosing to take an optional lab or not, obviously there's selection effects, and so when we account for that, if you trust my accounting, you can go into the paper that sits through all the details of how we did that. We find, again, no measurable added value across, I think it was 9 different courses at 3 different institutions, that there's no effect on their sort of exam performance. So again, it doesn't mean that you can't learn from an experiment. We know that experimentalists learn physics from experiments. We know that that's a thing. But in terms of the added value, what the resources are going in and what you're getting out of it on the other side, it's just not sort of supporting that. And so then if you're not learning the physics concepts, what's the point of the lab? And why do we have students doing labs in physics? And I think many physicists would say, because physics is an empirical science and you should look at data, you should understand data. And so that's where this sort of skills-based focus has come into play. And so then the question of how much does it need to look like real physics to help them develop those skills is the question. And so far I don't know the answer.
So sorry, this is a little long question.
Okay.
So, I heard Emily say fixing a car, which is funny because when I was a freshman, Charlie Marcus said, I think we should get rid of the freshman labs and you just learn to, rebuild your engine, right? It's like this one, the idea that like you should learn to use tools, right? And things, right? And, and Andy's talking about like getting the equipment to work, right? There's this whole big part of what we think of an experiment that is setting up the apparatus, building it, like So I guess my question is it important that the lab actually be an experiment or actually measure something, right? Like, would students get as much out of it, like building a windmill or a solar car or a sailboat or something, you know, a telescope? Like, you know, is it important that you actually are doing an experiment where you manipulate something and measure a result? Like, is that?
I'm not going to answer that. I think that's an interesting question, right? Like, again, so on the one hand, if your goal is to develop skills, it probably doesn't matter the context in which you are developing those skills, right? I don't think that should matter. And yet, we have to be concerned about student motivation and all of the feelings that they come into our classrooms with, and we have to convince them that in that case, the context does matter. The goal does matter to be able to communicate to them, we think these are the learning goals and this is the context in which we're going to do it. I think then the other piece, you know, fixing a car kind of piece, for me, it's just a question of, okay, where is the physics line and where is the engineering line, and how do I deal with it? How do I straddle? How do I think about that piece? What does it mean for them to be taking a physics course? I don't know the answer.
Well,
I don't know.
But then, so is it important that the introductory lab be a physics lab, or would an engineering lab accomplish the same thing?
Right. That's a great question. And do we, you know, one of the things that we're trying to teach are these scientific practices, and many of the scientific practices are not unique to physics, right? They're relevant to biology and chemistry. So should we instead just have lab, right? But I think that there are contexts in which particular skills are more amenable to be learned in particular contexts, right? And I think that there are also ways of thinking and quantifying data and measurements in physics that don't show up in other scientific contexts. And again, that's where like the asking of a question is still important there. I don't know. But I think like an electronics lab course, for example, I think that's very different, right? Like I think understanding the equipment, in that case, like actually troubleshooting a circuit, you kind of need to know what to expect in order to understand if your circuit's working, right? So I think that there are versions of this that can still be authentic in different contexts. So, you know, really what we need to be thinking about is the arc of a physics major. What are the goals and where are they getting taught in different places? And can you just map that and make sure that all of your bases are covered across the full spectrum?
Wait, Clayton, sure.
This is kind of related to that. I'm curious if you've thought about redesigning labs for like physics labs for non-physics majors, explicitly non-engineering majors, who tend to be maybe less engaged in learning the physics because they're not going to be physicists moving on. But you know, you still want to teach them things, and maybe I don't know, maybe this is a place where you would even want to delve more into like real world applications.
Yeah, and this is where we've started doing that more carefully with the biologists, right? Because for them, the feeling of like, physics is so strong that we are much more concerned about that. And so that's where that Hexbot lab came from, where now the whole premise of the entire course is how do we use simple physics models to model complex biological systems. That's the whole premise of the course. And so there it is, like, you are taking physics for a reason, and it's not just to pass the MCAT, I promise. And so that's the whole structure of that, is let's show you that there are ways of doing and thinking in physics that are going to be useful and applicable to biology problems. But we haven't done that well enough for engineering, and I think that is maybe that's the next pivot.
I think sure.
I'm sorry. You go.
Thank you for beautiful pedagogical examples, which I very enjoyable. But I wanted to ask you about the aspect which you didn't touch at all, which is the role of teacher. Mm-hmm. I think a big part of your success, the success of this program, is the fact that you and your team are interested in what you are doing. While in classical lab, many lab leaders are bored to death. And this feeling of being bored is super infectious. So if you are bored, then would you agree with this?
I totally agree. And I will say, so I have a colleague at the University of Washington Buffalo campus who, on a whim, decided to pick up our solid labs and implement them in her lab. And she had, for years, hated teaching lab, avoided it as much as she possibly could. And she called me one day she said, I finally feel like I'm doing science in this lab with these students.
So maybe your biggest achievement is that you excite your colleagues
I
to
hope
do
so.
something.
And I think the TAs that we've been working with, so with our teaching assistants, we've had mixed reactions where in some cases, and I think this goes across the board with faculty as well, in some cases the motivation of using the lab to demonstrate the lecture material is so deep and so ingrained that these labs are deeply uncomfortable for people. And that's sort of across the board. And so there is a lot of work and conversations that we have to have, discussions that we have to have to get everyone sort of on the same page with us about that motivation. But for the most part, many of the TAs do say like, oh, this is way more fun. And we've been tracking stuff like how much of the TAs talking to other students, like they're having more we can quantify their interactions, right? And so we quantify that they're actually having more and more substantial conversations with the students. They're not just like putting out fires, fixing the thing and it's not working. They're actually having conversations about like, what do you think's gonna happen? And like, how do you know? And is your data gonna fit that? And we're actually doing fun stuff.
Yeah, and then Andy?
You're finding that physics labs don't reinforce physics concepts. Does that track into biology and chemistry, or has anybody looked at that? I mean,
I don't think others have done a controlled study the way that we did. I would have to think about that. Yeah.
just curious.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Thank you.
Andy?
What about the student evaluations? Like, how do they rank how they enjoyed or rated the professors on each of these
trust
three?
Student evaluations. You know what? I haven't looked because I don't trust it as a reliable data source at all.
So we should not use that.
Well, you should. We do not have good student evaluations. We are about to overhaul our student evaluations, and hopefully they will be better. But I don't have a good controlled experiment on that one, unfortunately. We could compare this all. Let me think.
My impression is that you have here an excellent program for developing excellent experimentalists. I wonder what is your attitude towards future theoreticians. In particular, what I remember from my freshman days, the first time that I saw Maxwell's equations, they meant nothing to me. They did not talk to me. What would have been quite helpful is if at the same time or even beforehand, we had done some experiments, basically the experiments that were done in the 19th century that led to the Maxwell equation. Doing those experiments, maybe you don't have learned how to do an experiment, but when you saw Maxwell equations, oh yes, this is, it is a physical phenomenon that I saw in the laboratory.
Yeah, I think that there are similar lessons to take away that apply to theory, and I think this idea of, what would it mean to make our other physics assignments and things like that more quote unquote authentic. So there are Eric Burkholder, who's now at Auburn University, and my former postdoc advisor have done a lot of stuff on like really developing physics problem sets that are much more unstructured, and rather than just like, here's two variables, can you find the third one, right? It's more, you're gonna have to make up values and like make assumptions about the system and do this kind of more complicated modeling that I think, in my opinion, is a little bit more valuable to developing theorists, but I'm not a theorist. I just play with labs.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all the questions. Let's continue this lively discussion on 8th floor with some wine and cheese. And let's thank Professor Holmes again for wonderful talk.